Alrighty, hey guys, LMC back again for another video. I'm hanging out with my friends at A1 again on Saturday morning, and we've got this thing to ride. So this is the brand new addition to the Honda's LAMS lineup. This is the CBR650F. Now, you might remember I kind of rode this bike on the track a little while ago. That was the non-LAMS version, that was the full-blown version of it. So what they've done is they've essentially taken that bike, it's exactly the same, and they've just restricted it and stuck it on the LAMS market. Now I don't have much time with this bike today, so we're going to jump on board and go for a quick spin and see what it's like. Onto the bike itself. So I tell you what, it is bloody nice. It has a much lighter front end than my bike. I feel like the turning in of it is much easier to manage than compared to my 500. The 500 does feel like more of a bit of a clunker, if you like, for lack of a better word. That's not to say the 500's a bad bike. It's just that this, from the handling perspective, definitely feels kind of a little bit more precise and a little bit lighter and kind of easier to flick around, even though it is a bigger displacement bike. The gearbox and the clutch is also noticeably better. The gearbox, the clutch is much lighter, easier to pull than on my bike, and the gearbox is much smoother, much smoother. One thing, like for instance, then you wouldn't have seen it on the camera, but just as I was coming up that stretch and going from second back down into first and rolling to a stop, there was a much less noticeable clunk out of the gearbox in this bike compared to my one. In my one, you can really notice a big when you go down into first. So it's a much nicer gearbox and it feels much smoother as you click up through the gears. So all in all, so far it's clear to me that this is in a different category of like quality compared to the 500 series. Alrighty, let's test out the power band, see what she's got an 80k an hour strip ahead of us. Let's see what she's made of. So definitely got more pull than my bike, but I'll be honest, having ridden the non-restricted version, it is a little bit underwhelming, but you kind of expect that. But comparing it to my bike, it definitely pulls harder, but it's kind of an interesting power band. You definitely feel this sensation of all this power kind of picking up through the low to mid-range, and then it just plateaus, which is of course a characteristic of the restriction. In the original bike, the power curve would just kind of keep rising in a very predictable four-cylinder kind of way, but here it rises in a really kind of exciting way, and then it just hits the ceiling, and then it just sits there, and all of a sudden, you know, it just doesn't keep, you want it to keep pulling, but it doesn't. But look, I mean, that's the restriction period. It doesn't seem to be a throttle restriction, as in I can twist the throttle all the way open, so I don't know how they restrict it, but it certainly just caps the power band, kind of neuters it, if you like, at a certain range. But I mean, it still feels as smooth, still feels as good as the other bike. You just kind of, all of a sudden, you notice the power just sort of stops coming. It's quite a strange sensation. But look, this is deliberately set to be, I think, basically the maximum amount of power that you can get as a restricted license holder. That being said, it does have that same sensation of effortlessness that I mentioned when I was on the track riding the non-restricted version of this. You know, on my bike, when I'm kind of ringing it off the line a little bit, I really have to ring it, you know, I really have to kind of go, come on, get up there, and to get up to sort of like 80 k's an hour. I mean, it gets there fine, because it's a big-ish bike for a learner-approved bike. So it's not that it's slow, but certainly, you know, a couple of times riding this bike, I've taken off from the line and just looked down and caught myself going a little bit too quickly. So it still has that sensation of quite effortlessly getting up to speed, and much more effortlessly than the 500 series. But yeah, you do notice that the power band flattens off to sort of meet that LAMS restriction thing. But presumably, because they are charging you the full amount of money for this bike, like the same amount of money that you'd be charged for the non-restricted one, presumably once you get off your restrictions, you can probably do something a little about that. I would certainly hope that you could, if you're going to pay top dollar. I think that's the thing. If I was going to buy this thing, I would want to be sure, I want to be dead sure that when the time comes, I could de-restrict it and basically get the same bike that I would get if I paid for the non-restricted version. Okay, and that's definitely something you should consider, given that this is the exact same price as the non-restricted one. So yeah, food for thought. Now that I'm up here, I'll just reiterate what I said before. It definitely handles better than my bike. The handling is much sharper, much lighter. I think that's the thing that really I notice the most, and that surprises me the most actually, is that how much lighter it feels on the turn in and sort of holding the lines. Definitely, it feels like a much lighter bike than my bike does, even though I don't know the exact numbers, but the curb weight's probably not that much different. If anything, it's probably a little heavier than my bike, who knows. But in terms of once you're up and moving and on the road, it handles its weight so much better than my bike, and it gives you this sensation that you're really pushing a much lighter bike through the corners. The front end just feels much more agile. It's a noticeable improvement over the 500 series. And on top of that, the chassis and the brakes are like threefold better than my bike. The chassis especially, because the chassis has this feeling of much tighter feeling chassis. Everything feels much more composed on this bike than it does on the 500. My 500, when you throw around the corners, even though it's fine around the corners, it definitely feels a little bit more lurchy. It doesn't really feel as smooth and as together through the corners as this one does. So the chassis feels a lot better. The suspension's better, the brakes are all better as well. The brakes feel like they bite more. I mean, this has two front calipers, whereas my one only has one. But all in all, it's a much better package, and you can tell that it's a much tighter package. What are you doing, you spanner? Clever. Do a U-turn on a double line. Anyway, well, we're coming to the top of Sassafras now, so time to turn around and go back. So now on the way down, let's talk about this bike's position in the marketplace. So one of the things I've noticed with my bike, the 500, is I actually think the 500 series is an incredibly underrated bike. It's not the best bike in the world by any means, but it's really affordable for what it is, and it does everything really nicely. But it's definitely kind of fallen, I think, between the cracks of bikes like the Ninja 300 and bikes like the Yamaha MT-07. Now, the reason I use those two as examples is because those, at least here in Melbourne, like, those are the bikes you just see everywhere. Every second restricted motorcycle rider has either a Ninja 300 or an MT-07, and the only difference is whether they want, small and inexpensive for their first bike, or whether they want to go all out, spend a bit more money, and get as big as they can for their first bike. Good on you, dickhead. That's right. U-turn on a hairpin. That's a great idea. Oh, there's a lot of people doing silly U-turns out on the road today. Anyway, I digress. Yeah, so, and I think that's the reason the 500 falls between the cracks, because it's positioned in between the two of them in terms of displacement, and in between the two of those bikes in terms of price. So I think it gets skipped over, because I think people think, well, if I'm going to go budget and I'm going to save my pennies, I'll get a 300cc, and then they go and get something like the Ninja 300. Or if they think, no, I'm gonna splurge, I'm gonna lash out on my first bike, I'm gonna spend good money on my first bike, and I want it to be big, I want it to be powerful and all that kind of stuff, then they more often than not go and get the MT-07, because that's a great bike as well. So I think this bike, the CBR650F, and its naked counterpart, the new LAMS ones, I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens with this, because this will now give people who would otherwise buy the MT-07 another alternative from a really reputable brand. I mean, there are other 650cc bikes out there, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the MT-07 is the only one, but it is by far one of the most unpopular ones, certainly here in Melbourne. And I think the MT-07 is one of the biggest reasons why the 500 series may have suffered a bit, despite the 500 series being a good bike. Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see how this bike goes. Now, in terms of price, it is more expensive than the MT-07. It's about 11,800 retail, I think. And for those of you who are familiar with the non-restricted version of this bike, that's actually the exact same price. Now, before you jump up and down and say how ridiculous that is, because that was kind of my initial response as well, the reason it's exactly the same price is because it is actually exactly the same bike. So Honda haven't done anything to this bike to cheapen it, if you like. They haven't gone, right, this is a LAMS bike, we'll strip it of all its nice parts and we'll make it much more of a basic budget bike, which is what the 500 is. No, they've literally kept this identical, with the exception of that restriction, which we've already talked about. So that's why it's the same price. You are actually buying the same bike, but it will still be interesting to see whether Honda sells a whole lot of these bikes, because even though it's the same bike, and even if people know it's the same bike, there's still going to be that, well, why would I spend the same amount of money on the restricted version? You know, like, people, I think it's just going to mentally hurt them, because I think people are just going to think, nah, I don't want to spend almost 12 grand on that bike when I know the unrestricted one exists for the same price. I'd rather just wait till I get off my restrictions and then get the unrestricted one. That's kind of my worry with this bike. So, I mean, time will tell if that happens or not. I mean, do I think this bike is worth it? Yes, it is a much better bike than my bike, noticeably better in almost every single way. Better and better in all the ways I talked about on the way up this hill. So it's a much better bike. Is it better than the MT-07? I don't know. I haven't ridden the MT-07, so I really should go and do that. Of course, with my partnership with A1, they aren't a Yamaha dealer, so they don't have them. So I'll have to see if I can find a friend or something. There's a fellow motor vlogger, Suburban Knight, if you're watching this, you got to let me ride your MT-07 and compare it to this bike. Because, I mean, I've been spending this entire video comparing this bike to my bike, which is not entirely fair, because this one will be better. That's, you know, by definition, it's the much more upmarket bike. So a more fair comparison will be to take the MT-07 and do a head-to-head with this. But nevertheless, whether this bike does well or not, time will tell. The thing is that now people have another option, because this is quite different to the MT-07 in the sense that it's a 4-cylinder. So, and I mean, you can get the naked version of it. So I'm sure if people were looking at the MT-07, they're probably looking at the 650F naked version of this, not the R. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see, but at least people have another option. So I'm really interested to hear what you guys think in the comments. You know, what would you get? Would you get one of these, or would you get an MT-07, and why? Why is it that you choose one over the other? I mean, this is more expensive now than the MT-07, so it's kind of an interesting lineup, because you've got the 500, which is budget oriented, less than the MT-07. Now you've got the MT-07, which is about 10 grand, and now you've got this, which actually comes in over the top of the MT-07. See, I have no doubt that if this was exactly the same price as the MT-07, we'd be having a very different conversation, and I think this would be potentially a big MT-07 killer. But as it stands, because it is more expensive, I don't think it's a clear winner, but I do think it is another interesting option. You know, if I ever upgrade my bike, my 500, during my restriction period, if I get bored and I want something different, then this bike, or the naked version of it, will be on the list, and so will the MT-07, just to kind of see what's going on at the bigger end of LAMS restriction. But yeah, interesting stuff, interesting climate. Anyway, I'm going to take it back to A1 Motorcycles now. Wasn't allowed to have this for too long. In fact, I probably had it for longer than what they wanted me to have it. Oops, sorry. But until next time, I'll see you in the next video. See you guys.